So, no head? I'ma head out. Nestled deep in the Northwest Territories in Canada is an idyllic valley, and honestly, if you look at pictures, the first thing you want to do is go, because it makes a lot of the national parks you may be familiar with look pretty boring. We're talking beautiful rivers, mountains, forests, elk, moose, all this gorgeous wildlife, and the only downside to this is that throughout the 20th century, a whole bunch of people kept showing up without their heads. Dead, obviously. Like, there wasn't anybody running around like a chicken. But why? Why is there an entire Valley of Headless Men deep in the northern regions of Canada, and what's the explanation? These are questions that remain unanswered, and there are a lot of conspiracy theorists out there who would suggest that the reason they remain unanswered is because the Canadian government, in fact, knows what's going on and wants to keep it covered up. Equally likely is that the Canadian government doesn't know what's going on, can't figure out what's going on, and simply has decided to wash their hands of the whole issue. Well, as usual with these videos, at the end of the video, we're going to ask you to let us know what you think and decide. I mean, if you want to let us know what you think right now before watching the video, that would be kind of cool. Like, tell us, based on what what you think happened, and then, edit your comments at the end or add something to it. But to start here, we should really do what we usually do and start with the history of the region. Who lived here, when did they live there, and why did they leave? While the park itself is largely uninhabited today, except for a few private homes, cabins, and whatnot, and only accessible via a very long hike, a river trip, or flying into Glacier Lake, it was not always like that. The Nahanni River Valley was first inhabited around 8000 BC by several groups, and they came in successive waves. We have evidence of human habitation all along the 11,000 square miles that make up the park, and this generally comes from one single tribal group, the Dene. Now, the Dene peoples you might recognize because they are also referred to as the Athabascan people by their Algonquin neighbors. Or you might know them from another group of people, the Navajo and Apache Dene groups, which appear to have migrated out of Canada sometime around 1300 to 1400 BC. The Nahanni River Valley is dominated by the North and South Nahanni rivers, as well as their various offshoots, and these rivers spring from Mount Christie, which is a part of the Mackenzie Mountain Range. Like many places in the United States and Canada, the Nahanni River Valley takes its name from a local Native American tribe, in this case, the Naha tribe. But it's a little bit more complicated than it may seem on its face, because the Naha tribe haven't been there since 1300 BC. Local oral histories from the other Dene peoples of the region tell of a vicious tribe of raiders who lived up in the mountains, and much of the details around this are foggy and lost to time. We're talking oral tradition, we're not talking things that have been written down. But according to the Parks Canada website, the story here goes that the other tribes of the region got kind of sick of the Naha, gathered into a confederation, and marched up into the mountains, planning to exterminate them once and for all. They got there, took a look, figured out where the settlement was, and waited until nightfall, but upon approach, they discovered something very strange. While sleeping rolls were still laid out and fires were still going, there were no people there. Not a single one. And they never returned. Now, if we keep in mind the timing here, we know that this happened in the distant past for the people of the region, and we know that a Dene-speaking group of people shows up in the American Southwest around the same time, several years later, but still around the same era. We can extrapolate, and many scholars do, that the Navajo and Apache tribes may descend from the Naha. Of course, Naha and Navajo are similar enough words that they could easily have been connected. Several hundred years following this, when Europeans reached the area, they started setting up trading posts, and they would trade both with European trappers and hunters who went into the wilderness to collect skins and pelts and whatnot and bring them back to be traded into actual finished goods like hats and coats. They would also trade with the Native Americans of the region, who the Canadians generally call First Nations. So, for our American and Canadian viewers, you might be a little confused with the naming conventions here. That's more just a national difference. In the United States, Native American is perfectly acceptable, while in Canada, they do prefer the First Nations title. These trading hubs soon became pretty vibrant little settlements, and one of the cool things that I that I read about when I was researching this is that Dene traders from further up the river would actually go down the South Nahanni to places like Fort Laird and Fort Simpson, and they would do this in moose skin boats made out of 10 moose pelts, and then upon arrival, they would actually dismantle their boats and sell the skins. Trade in the region went on for a good amount of time before anything really strange happened, but around 1900, reports of significant gold deposits in the Nahanni River Valley started to surface all over Western Canada, especially in places like British Columbia, the Northwest Territories, and the Yukon. And these reports, while at first unfounded, did eventually draw some prospectors, and one group of these prospectors was the Mcleod brothers, Frank and Willie. Now, you may have heard of the name Charlie Mcleod, and that will get involved here, but not as soon as many other storytellers would have you think. You see, Charlie Mcleod was not actually on the first expedition that the Mcleod brothers took. It was just his brothers Frank and Willie, and what they were told by a native trader was that there was a vast gold deposit, a gold mine, off of Bennett Creek, which was an offshoot of the Flat River in the South Nahanni Valley. Willie and Frank, being Métis, or half-native, half-white settlers, decided that, you know what, they were going to go check this out. So they put together their little expedition, which was really just the two of them, and they set off. They took a mixed trail going both over land and on water from Telegraph Creek in British Columbia all the way up to Flat River in the Nahanni River Valley. Now, this is a 200-mile trek as the crow flies, so it's actually considerably longer on foot. So it took them a very long time to get there. It's not an easy journey whatsoever. And as I said, there are a number of more modern sources that say, yeah, Charlie was with them, but I cannot corroborate that from a single contemporary paper, and I looked. Upon reaching Bennett Creek, they immediately struck gold, or so the story goes, and decided to head a little bit further downriver to try their luck elsewhere. They succeeded at essentially every turn until they got to, and I am not kidding, this is the name of the rapids area, the Cascade of 13 Drops. Very cheery place to be. Now, we don't know exactly where this happened. They may have even gotten through a few of the drops, but let's be realistic. 13 is a considerable number of drops, and unlucky as it is. At some point during this, their boat capsized, which calling it a boat is actually a little bit generous. It was more of a makeshift raft put together with various sluices and other equipment. But it capsized, they lost all of their gold and most of their supplies, and while they were able to right the raft and fix it enough to get further down the river to Fort Simpson or Fort Laird, the sources kind of differ here, they did lose basically everything, and they would have to spend the winter at Fort Laird, which is south of the Nahanni River by about 100 kilometers. Of course, with winter approaching as the story goes, the brothers struck up various odd jobs as contract workers at Fort Laird, which was not a British or Canadian imperial fort, rather we're talking about a private fort, because this is America, well, the Americas, and, well, let's be realistic, we were settled by companies, not countries. So, the Hudson's Bay Company set up a number of forts in the Northwest Territory and basically ran the entire region as if it were their own private nation of fur trading. Now, initially during their stay in Fort Laird, the brothers tried to keep their discovery a secret. They didn't want other people going out and finding their gold. But over time, they started to gain a little bit of fame from it. People wanted to hear their story, and while most took it as sort of a tall tale, one guy in particular took them seriously and decided he wanted to go along for the trip. Now, his name is reported in several different ways. We don't know what it actually was, and for reasons you'll learn in a bit, there's really no way to confirm it, but most people agree that he was called Robert Weir. Another possibility is Wilkinson. He asked to join up with their merry little band of now 3 people, and in the spring of 1905, they set out on their trip back to Bennett Creek. Now, the Mcleod party was expected back in Fort Laird, or again, Fort Simpson, depending on the version of this story you go with, around the early winter of 1905. But, as you might expect at this point in the story, that did not happen. Now, initially it was assumed, because this happened rather often, that they weren't able to get back in time, and instead decided to make camp and wait for the spring of 1906. But 1906 came and went, and there were still no Mcleods, and also, of course, no Robert Weir. Another year passed, and 1907 saw no Mcleod return, and at this point, Charlie Mcleod, back in British Columbia, started to get a little bit nervous. Now, he knew his brothers were capable and experienced outdoorsmen and that he really didn't need to worry about them, but at the same time, he had stopped hearing from them and they had been gone far longer than they were actually supposed to be. So, like any responsible brother would, Charlie set out just as dangerous an excursion to go recover some people who were probably already dead. People were way cooler in the early 20th century. Charlie set off in 1908 and followed about the same path as they did. He started at Telegraph Creek and then made his way over to Fort Laird, which is about 100 miles southeast of Bennett Creek itself. Charlie either followed the same route that his brothers took, or he went directly to Fort Laird, or Fort Simpson. Again, it's really unclear where these guys actually left from, but he made his way up to their starting point for the second excursion. He also knew that Robert Weir would be with them, so he was asking both natives and Europeans, hey, have you seen 3 white men? They would appear as white. Of course, he and his brothers were all half native, but he was trying to get, the most information he possibly could. But no matter who he asked, nobody had seen them, at least not recently. Furthermore, the Mcleod brothers, being half native themselves, were actually pretty well accepted and well liked by the native communities of the region. They had a good relationship with them, they had traded with them, and they had often written back home about their experiences with friendly natives. In Charlie's journey, he eventually did reach a valley that appeared to be similar to the ones his brother had described to him. And upon paddling down the creek for a little while, he reached a clearing, and in that clearing, he found signs that humans had been there. Most specifically, he found a sled on which an inscription read, "We have found a fine prospect," and he recognized the handwriting as that of one of his brothers, although which brother it is specifically is not really recorded. But aside from the sled, there was really no evidence that anybody was still there. He paddled a little bit further down the river before coming to a second campsite. According to some versions of this story, that campsite was just outside of Second Canyon, which is a 10-mile stretch of the river that is surrounded on both sides by cliffs that can reach up to 3,000 feet high. These cliffs also are riddled with caves all up and down, and you can see the openings from the river. Now, while it's ostensibly very beautiful, you can understand how a 10-mile stretch of river where the cliffs go right up to the water's edge can be pretty claustrophobic. Just after the mouth of the second canyon opens up into a slightly less terrifying area, he found another campsite just on the edge of the water, in a little grove. It was nice and pretty. Here, he found a narrow beach with a rifle, a gold watch with the initials JH, a bone-handled pocket knife, a silver chain, a ring, an axe, a blanket, a Native American rug, and some 4440 cartridges. Also, he found the headless bodies of his 2 brothers. Sorry, I feel like I buried the lead there. Now, it actually was confirmed that the watch itself belonged to his mother. And interestingly enough, there was no trace of Robert Weir, and Charlie was able to identify the bodies based on their belongings. There was no DNA testing at the time. But he was pretty sure, looking at these 2 bodies, okay, these are my brothers. But what was really disturbing about the bodies themselves was not the fact that they were there. It was that they were there, and they were missing their heads. Furthermore, one of the skeletons, which they were pretty well decomposed at this point, but one of the skeletons appeared to be reaching for the rifle, which implies that, if not both of them, at least the one who was reaching for the rifle knew they were being attacked by something before it got to him. Now, what I think is important to mention here is a lot of people will suggest, oh, well, maybe they were attacked by wild animals, or maybe it was a situation where they died of starvation. I mean, it's suggested they died of starvation. That's actually one of the official legitimate explanations for this from the Canadian government, is that this was a death by natural causes, and that wolves or something took away their heads. If it was starvation, why was he reaching for the rifle? And if it weren't an attack, why was he in the position he was? I mean, let's think about it. In order for somebody to die in that position, their death would have to be pretty sudden. We're talking about being shot, being, impaled through the heart or the neck. They would have had to be paralyzed immediately and unable to move. If this was somebody who had been attacked by a wild animal, there likely would have been a struggle. They would have been fighting. They wouldn't have died reaching for the rifle. He must have died due to rapid trauma. But that is not the official explanation, and it wasn't the official explanation then either. Charlie, on the other hand, was pretty positive this is what happened. But Charlie wasn't done investigating. He wasn't happy to just take this fact that his brothers were dead and Robert Weir was nowhere to be found, he wanted to get to the bottom of it. He wanted to know what happened, and he had his theories. So he went back, he reported their deaths, and the Royal Northwestern Mounted Police, because this was before the advent of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, showed up to investigate the scene from Fort Simpson. Now, they were led by Corporal Arthur Melier, whose existence I actually was able to confirm via the Royal Northwestern Mounted Police's report from the years 1909 and 1910. So he's a real person. This is an investigation that did actually happen. They set off on their journey in 1909, and interviews with natives in the region turned up no clues. Nobody had seemed to have seen 3 white men making the trip that they allegedly had made. Now, the people at Fort Simpson, who had actually supplied the journey, if you've ever played the game Oregon Trail, this might sound really familiar to you, they were able to say, yeah, Willie, Frank, and Robert all left from Fort Simpson, they left with this much gear, and they were going this place. Now, there are versions of this story that suggest they left from Fort Liard, which I'm now realizing I've been incorrectly pronouncing this time as Laird. It's Liard. We all make mistakes. Everybody has those days. Now, the version where they leave from Fort Liard doesn't make a ton of sense to me. It's possible they went from Liard to Simpson, but Liard is 80 miles from the mouth of the South Nahanni, and Fort Simpson is another 80 to 100 miles north of that, so I'm not sure why they would even make that decision. It doesn't make a ton of sense. Most likely, somebody just misreported somewhere along the way here. Now, as they were making their way towards Bennett Creek and Flat River, where all of this had occurred, they did interview more and more natives, and a few did report that they had found a skeleton a little bit further down the river that could have been Robert Weir, and that is kind of the assumption today. Now, Corporal Arthur Melier's report actually does specify that the Little Nahanni natives that he spoke to were actually very friendly and very helpful, and, generally very hospitable to him. His report also specifies that another Mcleod brother, a Fred Mcleod, had a lot of doubts about his brother Charlie's version of events. He said Charlie was prone to exaggeration and that it was very unlikely, given their known relationship with the natives, that the natives would have done anything to them, and therefore there's really nobody that could have killed them. They must have died of natural causes. Fred, of course, was not there to see the skeletons, so at this point, we're just going based off of 2 brothers' understanding of their other 2 brothers. When Corporal Melier and his team, along with Charlie, did eventually reach the site where the Mcleod brothers had died, there was already so much disturbance to the area that there was nothing they could really tell. All they knew was, all right, well, these 2 people are obviously dead, they're missing their heads, and we know nothing else. So the case was just kind of unsolved and chalked up to be most likely of natural causes. But that would not be the last odd death in the Nahanni River Valley, even that decade. And that is because on September 28th, 1915, the headless body of Martin Jorgensen was found. Jorgensen's corpse was discovered 70 miles upriver of where the Mcleod brothers had been found, at least according to contemporary sources. I do want to make it very clear that there's a lot of gray areas here, and not a ton of exact measurements. Also, they say 70 miles, but they don't make it very clear if this is 70 miles as the crow flies or 70 miles on the river itself. They do say 70 miles upriver, so my assumption is that they're going based on nautical miles and following the curvature of the river, which would make a much shorter distance over, aerial measurement. Further complicating the matter with Martin Jorgensen is that he actually wasn't reported dead until 1916. In February, Constable William York of the Yukon Mounted Police was actually informed of this. A Corporal David Churchill was given command of this search effort, and I again was able to confirm his existence using the Royal Northwestern Mounted Police's own archives. Oddly enough, Jorgensen had met Corporal Arthur Melier during the search for the Mcleod brothers a few years earlier, so there's some weird through lines here. He may have actually been looking for the exact same gold that the Mcleod brothers had supposedly found. Also, at this juncture in the story, because it's about to become important, I must point out that I am not a very good reader of the French language, or my own handwriting, apparently. It was Corporal Arthur Malor, and the person we're going to be talking about in a second is Osias Melier. That's the Melier that I meant to be talking about. I mixed this up. I'm sorry, I am not a perfect man. Anyway, Osias Melier was in fact Martin Jorgensen's partner, and he was able to give Churchill a rough description of where he last saw Jorgensen. The problem? Where he last saw Jorgensen was in 1912, so it had been 4 years. There had been an entire presidential election cycle in the United States. I don't know what was going on in Canada. It's Canada. What we know is that Jorgensen had purchased clothing, a rifle, and a long-barreled revolver in Fort Simpson before heading into Nahanni for the winter, and that he had been planning to stay a considerable amount of time, whereas Mcleod only decided to stay until autumn. So Jorgensen planned to winter there, and Mcleod said, "I'd rather not do that," and went home. Before he left, however, they had agreed that they would meet at Fort Simpson in the summer of 1913. Jorgensen, however, did not show at Fort Simpson, and Mcleod, rather unconcerned considering how common this was, decided to go back to his home in Seattle and return to Nahanni in 1914. While he was searching for Jorgensen, Mcleod did come across one of their old cabins, and this would be a good thing if it weren't for the actual state of the cabin. It was burned out, and outside of it, he found a significantly rusted .38-55 rifle and a long-barrel .22 revolver. So, that matches the description of what Jorgensen was carrying with him when he left. Furthermore, there was also a bundle of clothes that Mcleod was able to identify as clothes that Jorgensen had actually purchased at Fort Simpson before their expedition even began. After finding the burned-out cabin with the weapons and clothes of his partner, Mcleod made the very, very understandable decision to stay in the valley where his partner had just gone missing for the winter, and then return to Fort Simpson in the spring of 1915, eventually reporting the find in September. This report would make its way to the constable in the February of 1916, and eventually get back to David Churchill later in 1916. A full year after the report of the burned-out cabin was made, Corporal Churchill and his team would set off from Fort Simpson in search of Martin Jorgensen. They set off on August 14th, and a few weeks later they would reach the cabin itself, which was in a grove of spruce and poplar trees just off of the Flat River. The cabin was about 200 yards off of the river itself, and some 150 yards from the riverbank they actually found a grave. They exhumed the bones and determined that yes, this was Martin Jorgensen, but, of course, his head was missing. Now, it's not clear from the story if his body was buried by his partner, Osias Mcleod, or if his body was buried by someone else. In either case, they did have to dig up the grave to identify him. Due to the fact that he was buried, however, they were unable to actually ascertain where his body had initially been, and therefore could not determine a cause of death. Although again, a burned-out cabin with rusted weapons outside, a bundle of clothes, and a nearby grave that doesn't have a head in it does suggest murder, in my opinion. Now, at this point, you might think, alright, maybe there's a serial killer on the loose. Well, that didn't deter other people from going out there, because John O'Brien was later found. He was out on a trapping expedition with a partner, and then he said he was going to go check his traps. He would be back in 8 to 9 days. But when 2 weeks passed and his partner decided to go looking for him, he unfortunately discovered a rather grisly scene. His partner would discover his body hunched over a campfire. Now, he was frozen solid, and there is the question of how did that happen, but Mounties didn't really suspect any sort of foul play, so they just went along and chalked it up to natural causes. But at this point, the bodies were stacking up, and these mysterious deaths would continue. The next person to turn up, not alive, was Phil Powers, and Phil Powers had gone out in the summer of 1931 to do some trapping, and was expected back that winter. For a full year, he did not return to Fort Liard, and eventually the Mounties there decided we should go looking for him. A small team led by Constable Duncan Martin set off and made their way deep into the Nahanni River Valley along the same sort of trail that their predecessors Churchill and Mcleod would have taken. Along the river, they actually managed to pick up prospectors Albert Fail and Pole Field, who told them that, of course, Phil Powers had made camp along Flat River. When they arrived at the campsite, they found, as you would be expecting at this point, a burned-out cabin, but Phil Powers' body was in the cabin. It was, of course, now just bones, but somehow, for some reason, the story records that he had been reading a magazine when he died. I'm not sure how they were able to determine that he was reading a magazine when he died, since the cabin had ostensibly been burned to the ground. There, I guess, was some structural remains, but most of it was ashes. But it begs the question, how does somebody burn to death while reading a magazine? How do you not realize that you're burning to death Well, like, the magazine cannot possibly be that enthralling. This month's issue of People cannot be so interesting that you're literally willing to burn to death while reading it. The report itself doesn't specify whether or not his head was there. I would assume if it's not specified that it wasn't there, it probably was. But despite the very confusing circumstances of, yeah, we think he was reading a magazine, but the cabin also burned down, so we're just gonna rule this an accident. Like, bravo. Great detective work, guys. And of course, it didn't stop there. There were more people to die. In February of 1936, pilot George Dalziel dropped off 2 prospectors or hunters at Glacier Lake. William Epler and Joseph Mulholland landed about 155 miles up the river and set about their little prospecting course. Now, they were expected back by May, which is actually a pretty short journey into Nahanni, but they didn't show up. The search was launched rather quickly because at this point, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who had been formed from just the various provincial mounted polices into one federal body, knew that there was some strangeness going on and it was important to get out there as soon as possible. The pilot, Dalziel, flew himself and a small team, including Constable Winston Graham, because of course everyone has to have the most British name possible, out to the location where they found... Aiden, what do you think they found?
Dead bodies? Headless bodies?
Well, I was more talking about a burned out cabin, but close.
Fair.
In fact, for the first time, they found no bodies, which honestly just leads to so many more questions about where they went. Now, as we get into this part of the story, this is really the last of the earlier 20th century deaths, because after this, we're talking about much more recent stuff. And they really do cool off for a long time, partially because the Canadian government starts discouraging prospecting in the area. Now, I want to point out that a lot of this information comes from a writer from the Yukon whose name is Dan Sawatsky. He has passed away since. But he is adamant in his work that he does not believe this to have been the work of natives or monsters or anything like that there's no supernatural involvement, but rather that these are just a series of unfortunate disasters by unprepared woodsmen. On the other hand, every single account implies that these were very, very prepared woodsmen. Now, due to some later government efforts that I will get to, there aren't that many deaths after the Epler and Mulholland deaths. But that does not mean there were no more, because in 2005, David Horsey and Fred Hardesty went missing in the Nahanni River Valley. Now, this time it was actually on the North Nahanni River, not the South Nahanni River, but they had just gone out to stay at a friend's cabin for the weekend, and really nobody expected anything to go wrong. Again, this is 2005. There's cell phones, there's internet, there's rapid communication, and ease of access to all of these areas. They should have been just fine, and on top of that, these guys were experienced outdoorsmen. They left, of course, Fort Simpson on June 12th, 2005, and that is the last time that anyone saw these two alive. And this was not the same situation where we're talking about weeks or months or even years between somebody leaving and then being reported missing. They were reported missing by the owner of the cabin 4 days later on June 16th. And there are contemporary news reports about this case updated like daily, every time something came in, because again, we're talking about the internet era here. This is something that people were following very closely and writing about as it happened. There was not enough time for mysteries to arise. When the owner of the cabin arrived to check on them on June 16th, he found that neither of them were there. There were no signs of a struggle. There were weapons inside the cabin. There was plenty of food. There was water. There was really no reason for them to not be there. It wasn't like they ran out of supplies and had to go forage. And this was confirmed by Constable Brad Parker of the Fort Simpson Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who said they really had no reason to exit the cabin. Now, the search, of course, had been launched on the 16th or 17th when they were reported missing, and by June 23rd, the Mounties had pulled out. They had determined that this was no longer a law enforcement matter, so they had no place in it. But the families in search and rescue, of course, were not done looking for their missing family members, and as it had only been a couple of weeks, they were pretty sure that they could find these guys alive. Now, in the case of when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police pulled out, it hadn't even been a couple of weeks. It had been like 7 days. So they were pretty certain that they could find their relatives. Unfortunately, Horsey's body would be found first on June 27th. He was found out in the bush, and of course, by the bush, we don't mean a physical, like, shrub. We mean the wilderness, the dense wilderness. He was found out there about 4 kilometers from the cabin. And yes, I did just switch from miles to kilometers because apparently that switch happened sometime between 1936 and 2005. So we're in kilometers now. Congratulations, Canada, you won. Now, officials, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who, again, weren't there, claimed that the body was completely intact and there was no sign of foul play. However, Jonas Antoine, a family friend and a member of the search party, remarked that there were very clearly burn marks on Horsey's arms. Why? On top of that, the spot where they found him had been searched multiple times, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police did say that, oh, well, it was pretty dense brush, it was hard, you'd probably just, they just missed it the first few times. But as I said before, they were not involved in the search at this point. They were just reporting on it, and that kind of boils my blood a little bit that they're trying to explain away what the actual searchers found. And this is kind of a common thread in a lot of cases like this, where they'll search an area multiple times before finding someone, and a lot of the times, yeah, sure, you can chalk it up to, oh, well, they just missed it. But sometimes that's just not enough, especially when there's burn marks on the arms and there was no reason to leave the cabin. Why were they out there in the first place? There's too many questions here for me to believe what the Canadian Mounted Police said. Another important and interesting bit of information here is that an article titled "Fire May Be Clue to Fate of Missing Simpson Men," published June 24th, 2005, seems to have been scrubbed from the website, although the hyperlink is still there. So, what happened to the article? Why is every other article on this case accessible except that one? I'm not saying there's a conspiracy, but I am saying that's weird. However, Hardesty was still missing, so the search didn't end. They kept looking, hoping that they could recover at least one of the 2 men. Unfortunately, on July 7th, 2005, Hardesty's body was found floating in the Nahanni River Valley, the North Nahanni River Valley, and, of course, in an area that had already been searched. Now, in this case, we're talking about a body of water, which is inherently moving, so it's a little bit less weird that the area had already been searched, but still, you wonder, how to get there. Now, he was found 20 kilometers from the cabin, in the water. The RCMP basically took this, looked at it, and said, all right, well, unfortunately, they're both dead, but we really don't think there was any foul play here, so we're going to close the case and chalk it up to some sort of accident or, them deciding to go for a hike and getting lost. But that didn't sit well with the families, and it also didn't sit well with the Lidley First Nation peoples of the region, who argued that this was not an in-depth enough investigation, and the mounted police were just kind of ignoring it. And they didn't really just leave it alone either. In 2018, the families of Horsey and Hardesty actually asked the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to reopen the investigation and petitioned and gave their evidence for why they thought that things had not been properly handled, but the RCMP seems to have decided not to reopen the case. And for causes of death, they ruled it as hypothermia for Horsey and drowning for Hardesty, despite there not being a ton of evidence for how those two things happened. Now, of course, nobody's really arguing with the causes of death here. Rather, what they were arguing with is the lack of any interest from law enforcement into how these two bodies got to where they were. And it was never determined by the RCMP how that happened, why they left the cabin, why they separated, any of it. So, what could it have been? Well, as with anything like this, there's always the people who believe it was a supernatural event. And that comes from a number of oral stories. First, we should ask the question, why did the Naha tribe vanish? Did they know that they were about to be attacked and decided that the better course of action was to march several thousand miles south out of their homeland in this idyllic, lush valley in northern Canada into the deserts of the American Southwest? Why would they do that? Well, there are some stories that indicate that it wasn't just they were worried about the extinction of their people at the hands of their neighbors, but rather that the valley itself is haunted. And the stories about the valley being haunted come first from the tale of a man named Frank Henderson, who actually recounted the whole thing in the Calgary Herald, but I cannot get access to the Calgary Herald from 1946, even through JSTOR, so, this is kind of hearsay at this point, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Frank Henderson and his partner, Jack Patterson, were leading an expedition near Virginia Falls, which is a very, very tall an intense waterfall 3 times higher than Niagara Falls. So we're, pretty dangerous little location here. They separated for several weeks, but before leaving had planned a meeting point, and whoever got there first, if they decided to head back, was going to leave a mark on a tree, and, ostensibly they would figure it out from there. Patterson never came back, and Henderson, after waiting for a while with his part of the expedition, says that one night they were awakened by Native Americans who told them of pale-faced demons who stalked the valley at night, killing travelers who decided to prospect and hunt and basically get up in their territory. Henderson left the valley, told his story, and unfortunately, Patterson was never found, which leads to a later expedition by a man named John Poirel. Now, John Poirel was a climber and rappeller, a very, very experienced outdoorsman, kind of a thrill seeker kind of guy, and also an explorer. And he set off to actually map this area in a more intense way than it had ever been done before, because part of the Nahanni River Valley is these cave systems all along these tall cliffs that start at the waterline, and you can see entrances and exits to the caves all the way up for thousands of feet. So in 1964, Poirel set out and decided to map those caves and see what was in them and, go back and tell people. Now, of course, he wasn't able to get very deep into all the 250 caverns that he marked, but he did find something interesting in one of them. In a cavern that he would later name Valley Cavern after his daughter, he would find 116 doll sheep skeletons dated to about 2500 BC. Now, Valley Cavern is not at the waterline. It's also not at the top. It's about midway down the cliff. How did 116 doll sheep get into a cave halfway down a sheer cliff? I could understand a few doll sheep doing that. 116 is a lot of sheep. In my opinion, as a historian, that many sheep skeletons being in one place is kind of indicative of human activity, of predation, of those sheep skeletons being brought there, not just finding their way in there. Now, Poirel would, of course, return with Pierre Trudeau, then Prime Minister of Canada, and ostensibly the father of Justin Trudeau, although we all know that his dad is actually Fidel Castro. Do not at me. I'm right about this. Look it up for yourselves. Fidel Castro is Justin Trudeau's father. I will not be taking questions. Anyway, they decided to turn it into a national park, and to date, you can't actually go and explore any new caverns without the express permission of the Canadian government, and they do not give that permission out lightly. Now, they claim that this is because they don't want to disturb the ecosystems or mar the landscape in any way, but as we all know, I don't trust the American National Park Service, and I don't trust the Canadian one either. Now, I'm not saying that I think that this is the result of pale-faced demons or anything supernatural. I don't think there's enough evidence to really go one way or the other on this. But there's enough strangeness going on in the Nahanni National Park Preserve that I think there are questions to be asked and explanations yet to be given. But of course, I'd love to know what you guys think. So, in the comments section, let us know. If you haven't yet and you liked this video, smash the like button. I'm going to keep that in. I'm going to keep that one in. Burp the like button. And while you're burping the like button, make sure to check out the links in our description where you can get our signature coffee, Mount Pocono Perk, roasted by Tableau Roasting Company in Kentucky, USA. You can also get to our Target sponsorship if you like Target's clothes. I am wearing a Target Goodfellow t-shirt right now. If you've watched a lot of our videos, you've probably noticed I wear this shirt a lot. That's because it is comfy as hell. And, I mean, look at it. It's heathered. It's nice. Like, this does not look like a $15 shirt, does it? No, it doesn't. That's right. Check it out and buy them. And if you do, it helps us. Or if you're feeling a little bit more funky, you can check out our Amazon store, which is in the link tree in the description. We have books, we have candles, we have whiskey supplies, we have coffee supplies, and if you're interested in getting started doing what we do, we also have 2 idea lists, one for streaming with the equipment that we actually use, and then another one with budget streaming equipment, stuff that we have used in the past, know it's good, and works if you're not quite at the level where you're ready to invest a few $1,000s. So feel free to check that out, and I think that covers just about everything. So, without further ado, I'm Aiden Mattis. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.